Hi, so I will be showing you how to make FPS controls with Unity's new input system because the old one is getting phased out. So here we have a starting scene. We just have a player and a plane. The player is set up like so. He has a capsule collider, a rigid body, and a configurable joint. For the rigid body, you want to set the mass to 4 and lock rotation for all 3 axes. For the configurable joint, you want to set the Y drive position spring to 20 and maximum force to 2. And lastly, the projection mode you want to set to position and rotation. And here is the input manager setup. We have a 2D composite vector for WASD controls on the keyboard, and just basic buttons for other functions. Lastly, we have a mouse, set action type set to value and control type to vector 2, path set to mouse delta. And so let's get into the code. So in our scripts, we want to create a new C# script called player controller. And another one called player movement. So player movement will handle all the moving and forces, and player controller will handle all input. So here our code is open in Visual Studio. First you want to put using and then the input system. Then we want to declare some things. So motor, there we go. And then we want to call it vector 2 and call it move input, and we'll just leave it at that for now. Then we want to add a method called awake, and then we want to assign our value. So motor is get component, and we want to call it, and we want to get player movement. And then lastly, we'll also want to get controls equals new input manager. So then in our update function, we want to get the values from our keyboard and make it do things. So move. So what this does is this sets move input to the vector 2 that we get from our WASD controls. And then we want to add a motor.move, and then we want to say get final val move input.x move input.y. So what this will do is get the x value and the y value of the vector 2. Then we will write this function down here, get final val, so void get final val, and it's going to need to take 2 arguments, so float axis x and float axis y. And then we want to do some math. Actually, this should be vector 3, my bad. So what this will do is convert the vector 2 input to a vector 3 for our motor, so player movement, to actually move our character. So we want to do vector 3 move horse. Then we want to do another one for the side, so X is Z, not Y. My bad. And then you want to get a final velocity based on those two. So like if the final is equal to both of those, so times speed, speed, and then we want to return final value. So then we go back up here and let's add a float speed and default it to 5. Don't forget the semicolon. Then now let's go to our player movement. And so same as before, we want to get rid of the using system. And we want to require component rigid body. Then we want to have a private vector 3. So and we want to default it to 0. So 0. Now, before we create our move function, we need to add a few more things. So I'm going to use serialized field here. What this does is this allows us to edit these values inside the Unity editor, but we're still allowed to make but we can still make these private. So private rigid body, and it's called RB. And in our start this time, we're gonna do RB equals to get component rigid body. Next, we want to create the move function that we referenced before. So we'll call it public move. Oops. Should have added a void there. Void move. And what we want to do is simply final vel equals to velocity. And then we want to take a vector 3 argument, velocity. And there we have our move function. Now we need to create another one, which is called void perform movement. This one won't take any arguments. And if final velocity is not equal to 0, so vector 3.0, we want it to move. So we want to do rigid body move position. Move position is nice because it will take into account walls and other things. And it's going to become rigid body dot position, so where you currently are, plus final velocity times time dot fixed delta time. Okay, so now instead of update, we want to use fixed update. Capital F. And we want to call our perform movement function. So now let's save both of those and let's go back into the Unity editor. So now we're in the Unity editor, and you can see that you drag these two in and they'll become a component. Then you want to drag the rigid body in to RB here. Now one more thing before we're ready to test this, you will want to go back into player controller and you want to create a void on enable, and then you want to type controls dot enable. So that will enable your controls, and the same thing for disable. So let's save both of those. Let's go back into the Unity editor. And you can see on the camera that we actually can move. Alright, so now that we have movement, let's go to looking around with the camera. So here we are back in our player update. We want to first create another vector2 another vector2 under move input and call it look input. And also under speed, let's add a look speed and we'll default it to 0.1. So next what we want to do is we want to go back into update and do something similar for looking around. We want to do look input is equal to controls dot mouse keyboard dot mouse this time, and then read value as a vector2. Next, what we want to do with this is we want to create a vector3 named y rotation or y rot named equal to new vector3 with 0 look input dot x and 0, and want to multiply that by look speed. Then we want to do motor dot rotate and want to give it the parameter y rot. So we're going to create this in the player movement script. But first, this will handle left and right. Let's do up and down next. So we're going to do float, and x cam rot is equal to look input dot y this time times look speed. Next, you want to do motor dot rotate cam this time and call it feed it x cam rot. Nice. Now we go back into our player movement script and we need to add a few more variables. So first, let's give it a private vector3 named rotation, and we'll set it equal to 0 too. Then we need some variables for the camera. So private float cam rotation x. We'll default all these to 0. Oops. And then we need a current cam rotation. We need a rotation limit so we're not spinning endlessly. So cam limit. And let's set it to 100 so you can look up and down. Oh, my bad, I forgot to float here. That's better. Next, same as the rigid body, let's private camera cam. And let's serialize field that too, so you can drag it in. And then next, we want to create the functions we mentioned earlier. So public rotate, and we want to feed it a vector3. Let's call it rotate vector. Oops, public void rotate, there we go. Next, you want to rotation is equal to rotate vector, and that's that. Next, rotate cam also takes a vector 3, and let's call it camRot vector. And then we set cam rotation x equals to camRot vector. Next, we want a void perform rotation this time. And under that, we want to do rigid body dot move rotation. And now this needs a special type of argument, and so we'll use a function called quaternion.euler to do it for us. So if we multiply that by quaternion.euler and feed in rotation, that'll do all the math we need. Next, we want to do current cam rotation x minus equals to cam rotation x. So what that is going to do is that'll change our current camera. Move rotation will change our looking sideways, and cam rotation will change up and down. Next, we want to clamp the angles so we're not looking infinitely. Cam rotation.x is equal to mathf.clamp current cam rotation.x negative cam rot limit and cam rot limit. And lastly, we need cam.transform.local Euler angles is equal to a new vector 3 called current cam rotation x 0f 0. Now if we save that, oh, my bad. Under rotate cam, we want to change it to type float, not type vector. And vector 3. So we'll save both of these. And let's go back to the Unity editor. So here we are back in the Unity editor. We need to drag FPS cam into cam here, so then it knows which it is. But then before we can get started, we need to go to our player movement, and under fixed update, we need to call perform rotation. So save that, and if we run it, we can see we can now look around and move. So now let's do the jumping. I've hopped back into the Visual Studio here, and at the top here of player controller, you're going to want a require component, and it's going to be type of configurable joint, so in the setup. Then we're going to create a private configurable joint and name it joint. And then, so there's a few more things we need to set up here. So first we need a boolean, and it's space pressed. Then let's set a private float, and let's call it jetpack force, and we'll default it to say 1000. Next, we want a vector 3, and we'll call it underscore jetpack force, and we'll default it to 0. Lastly, we need to do some setup for the joint, so we'll give it a header called joint config, and we'll serialize these fields. So serialize field, private, and joint projection mode, joint mode is going to be equal to joint projection mode dot position and rotation. Then let's serialize field again, and we're going to do private float joint spring equals to 20. And serialize field again. Lastly, private float and joint max force is equal to 40. So now we're gonna go all the way down and create a new method. So we're gonna say private void set joint settings. And it's gonna take a float, and we're just gonna call it underscore joint spring. So joint dot projection mode is gonna be equal to joint mode. And then this next part, the syntax is gonna be a little bit interesting. We're gonna do joint dot y drive is going to equal to a new joint drive and curly brackets position spring is going to equal to underscore joint spring, comma, maximum force is going to be equal to joint max force, and semicolon at the end. And that's the set joint settings method. Let's go back up to update. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna update the space pressed boolean to determine whether we should be jumping or flying. So we're gonna go keyboard.current space key dot was press this frame. And we're gonna say space press is equal to true. Next, if, and I'm just gonna copy and paste this and change was pressed to was released. Space pressed would be equal to false. Lastly, we need a if space pressed. We don't need to do an equal to because it's already a boolean. We want to set underscore jetpack force to be equal to vector3 dot up, and we want to multiply it by jetpack force. Then we want to set joint settings to 0. And we just need an else at the end that to set joint settings to joint spring. And at the very end we want a motor dot move jetpack. And you want to give it jetpack force. So that's everything in our player controller. Let's move over to player movement. So we only need to add one more thing at the top here, and that would be private vector3. We want to call it jetpack force, and let's zero it. Then we'll put this right here. We're gonna call it move jetpack. So public void move jetpack. Jetpack. And we're gonna call it jetpack force is equal to underscore jetpack force. And of course up here we're gonna give it an argument for vector 3. Now, under perform movement, what we're going to do is we're going to add another if statement. If jetpack force is not equal to 0, then we're going to do rigid body dot add force this time instead of move position. Jetpack force times time dot fix delta time. But one more thing, we're going to force mode. So I forgot, under awake you needed to add a joint is equal to get component configurable joint. So I'm sorry about that. If we save that, and if we go back to the Unity editor, let's clear everything and let's run it. And as you can see, we can look around, and now we can jump and hover. So if you hold space, it'll hover. And that's FPS controls. So thank you to everybody for watching. Code will be in the description. I'd also like to thank YouTube channel Brackey that helped me a lot with figuring out the logic behind all of this. And if you have any questions, put them in the comments and I'll try to fix them for you. Thanks.